Welcome back. Now, ahead of the BRICS summit next week, let's size up the BRICS economies. South Africa, of course, is tiny in relation to the mega economies of China and India, and we have underperformed in terms of growth for years. But we, being one of the members of the BRICS nations, has already given South Africa access to funding from the BRICS Bank, and it's hoped that closer trade ties could lead to more trade and other benefits as well. Well, earlier this year, the BRICS overtook the G7 countries in terms of the share of global GDP. So that means that China, Brazil, Russia, India and South Africa combined are bigger than the economies of Canada, Japan, the US, the UK and the European Union combined. So that was a significant event. Let's look at expectations for the future, and we'll bring up this graph. This is according to Goldman Sachs that produced the graph. It's saying that China is expected to overtake the United States as the biggest economy this year, and over the next 50 years or so, India is expected to catch up and overtake the USA to become the second largest economy in the world. In 2001, let's just look at the history. Economists coined the term BRIC, referring to the big emerging economies at the time: Brazil, Russia, India and China. That was a Goldman Sachs economist. The predictions about how the world economy would be shaped by those economies drove investment at the time. And then, surprise, surprise, the four countries formed a political alliance in 2009, and South Africa was invited to join in 2011. Now, many countries are knocking at the door to join the BRICS nations, and you can see there, that's a future projection that in the future, China will be number one in the world, India will be number two, and India is really shooting the lights out in many respects, and that overtaking of China of the USA will happen by around 20 or 30 or so. A correction from earlier, I said this year, but actually this is looking ahead at 2027 and thereafter and into the future to 2070. By then, India is expected to be number two in the world. All right, we are hoping to speak to Old Mutual about the BRICS economies, about the size of these BRICS nations. Of course, we've shown you the good news that India is performing well and that China is expected to overtake the United States. But there are huge concerns about the Chinese economy right now, concerns about indebtedness in that economy, about the performance of the property market. And in fact, that is something weighing on markets this week in the run-up to the BRICS summit next week. So we will be looking over the course of this week, delving into these different economies and how they're faring. We know how South Africa is performing, underperforming in terms of global growth, in terms of any sort of average. The good news today that unemployment has come down, but very, very slightly. All right, before the break, we were looking at the sheer size of the BRICS economy, the five nations combined, and of course many more countries want to join. The BRICS overtaking the G7 in terms of a share of global GDP. We're now joined by Izak Odendaal, who is the Old Mutual Wealth Investment Strategist. Thank you, Mr. Odendaal, for being with us. The BRICS economies overtaking G7. Presumably we should be courting both, but how beneficial is it to us, even though we're small, to be part of this grouping right now?
Yeah, that's an important question. And I think so far it's hard to point to really tangible benefits that we've gotten from being part of BRICS. And I think it's also important to remember that BRICS is still a fairly informal collection of countries. There's no founding treaty that binds these countries together. There's no free trade agreement. Yes, there's cooperation, in certain areas, but so far it's still a fairly, as I said, loose, informal collection of countries. And so for us to really, really benefit strongly from BRICS, We need to see things like free trade agreements. We need to have access to those giant markets in China and India. That will really be of tremendous benefit. I think so far it's mainly been symbolic. The fact that we get to play on a stage with economies that really are much, much bigger than we are.
Is that the hope, that there will be more trade? I know there are hopes that even China and India will start trading more with each other because that will have huge effects for the global economy and for us. But is the hope that closer access will ultimately lead to something like trade agreements?
Well, I should hope so. Otherwise, what really is the point? I mean, we need to be acting, I think, in our own interest here. And our interest is to grow our economy and to create jobs. And to do that, I think it'll be greatly beneficial if we could have more access to, for instance, the Chinese and Indian economies, and we can diversify our exports into those economies. Obviously, we mostly export raw materials, but if we can diversify into other areas and, of course, attract tourists from those economies, that'll be very beneficial to South Africa. And yes, indeed, if trade grows between the BRICS countries, that will be good for the global economy as well. I think the problem is the problem is that, as we've seen of late, is that the world is actually becoming a bit hostile towards free trade and a bit hostile towards greater integration. There's this whole idea of friendshoring. We're going to do more business with people who are closer to us and friendlier to us. And that really seems to take a step back if you consider how much globalization contributed to much faster global growth over the last 2 decades, 3 decades even, and how many people were lifted out of poverty as a result.
Yeah, that is a big pity. So that hope is there, but let's look at the economies very quickly. China, there's been a lot of concern around China of late. Can you tell us what's going on in a nutshell, and does that sort of dampen the outlook for BRICS as a group in future?
Well, yes and no. I mean, because China is still a big economy and it's still going to be a massive economy. It's still going to be a massive market for countries like South Africa and others. But clearly what's happened in China is that their very, very rapid economic growth over the last 2-3 decades, I think that phase of their development is now running out of road. And China is in the middle of a property bubble that's busy bursting. And historical experience from other countries suggests that once you go through that kind of example, you're faced with much slower growth. We also know that China has very high debt levels. It has very poor demographics. So yeah, looking ahead, don't expect 5, 6, 7% GDP growth in China. Expect 2-3%. But as I said, it's still going to be a massive economy. It's still going to be a major trading partner for South Africa.
And we looked at predictions from Goldman Sachs before the break that India will become second largest in the world a few decades after China overtakes the United States. Even now, everybody is looking at India. Is it the next China in terms of explosive growth, possibly?
Yeah, India is growing very rapidly, and it has some characteristics that it shares with China. Obviously, it's massive in terms of population size, also has a very high savings rate, very high investment rate. So it's got all the characteristics for rapid economic growth, sustained economic growth. It's not going to be like China, though, because I think China just did things at an extreme in terms of its the voracious demand for commodities, the extent to which it invested in its economy, and of course this property bubble, which I think now with hindsight it's becoming quite clear that so much of Chinese, the really, really rapid growth that we saw in China and the strong demand for commodities, a lot of that was just going into this property bubble. Hopefully India can avoid the same kind of mistake. So yeah, India still has many, many years of economic growth ahead of it. It's still a poor country in terms of per capita income, much poorer, for instance, than South Africa. So I think there's still many years of growth and development ahead in India. And yeah, I don't think we should be too fixated on who's number one and who's number two. I think the main thing for us is, can we participate as South Africans? Can we trade with India? Can we get Indian tourists here? Can we draw on our very long historic cultural links with India? We should be well placed to benefit from India's growth.
Very quickly, you said yes, we need to see the tangible benefits, but we have had access to some BRICS bank loans, haven't we? I mean, isn't that the possible upside as well, and possible involvement in a new currency? All right.
Yeah,
okay, we can hear you, we can see you, but carry on talking.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, look, the BRICS currency I would completely discount. I think that's a fantasy. The BRICS Development Bank is I think the one tangible thing that's come out of BRICS, and we have drawn some credit lines from that bank during the dark days of COVID. Yeah, so that is one benefit. I think whether it's a complete game changer from a South African point of view is hard to say. We haven't really seen it investing heavily in infrastructure in South Africa, and then it's a bank, right? So you borrow from them and you have to repay, even if they do give you favorable interest rates.
All right, thank you. We appreciate that holistic look at the BRICS economy. How can we make it work for us? We are a small player among the other 4 BRIC nations. Remember, they were the incipients, and then South Africa was invited to join. It may get bigger. Many nations are asking to join the BRICS formation, and of course that will be one of the topics under discussion next week. That was Old Mutual Wealth Investment Strategist Izak Odendaal.